2007 was an absolutely ridiculous year for racing games. Forza Motorsport 2 had arrived on Xbox 360 with hundreds of cars, tuning, upgrades, and enough telemetry data to convince me that adjusting tyre pressure was a meaningful use of my entire evening. Spoiler warning, it obviously wasn't. Colin McRae Dirt had completely reinvented Codemasters Rally series with beautiful graphics, multiple disciplines, and a much more cinematic presentation. And just on the horizon, you had Project Gotham Racing 4. It was going to have cars, bikes, dynamic weather, and an enormous career mode. And then Sega released Sega Rally, a game where the main objective was essentially go sideways, do it again, and try to win. There were no vehicle upgrades, no elaborate career or damage modelling, no complicated team management. Sega Rally looked at approximately a decade of evolution in racing games and politely said, "No." So Sega Rally was released in September of 2007 here in Europe. In fact, it was developed by a new studio established here in the UK by Sega, aptly called Sega Racing Studio. I mean, at least we know what kind of games they're gonna make, right? Well, actually they only made one game, and it was this. Anyway, just a couple of weeks later in America, this game would release in October of 2007 under the name Sega Rally Revo. A little bit more energetic, and I kind of get it because there was a bit of a revolution going on with this game. So the question we want to find out today is Sega Rally an overlooked arcade classic? Or is it just a little bit shallow? Now, just for reference, all footage you're seeing today of the game has been captured off of my original Xbox 360 that's still holding up after all these years, and I recently picked this game up on Vinted for like £3, so there we go. Anyway, without further ado, let's jump into the game. So before we answer that question, we must first dive into the history of Sega Rally. So the original Sega Rally Championship began operating in Japanese arcades in February of 1995. Developed by Sega AM3 for the Model 2 arcade hardware, it built its racing around different surfaces, compact tracks, and very controlled power slides, rather than attempting to simulate traditional point-to-point rallying. The game was a major arcade hit, having 3 main environments, and during development, advice from actual rally drivers. It was then converted to the Sega Saturn, becoming one of the defining racing games on the system. And Sega Rally's appeal was like insanely simple, guys. The cars felt good, the tracks were memorable, and you could pretty much understand what the entire game was about pretty much immediately. Easy right, medium left, maybe. And then came Sega Rally 2, which expanded everything considerably and eventually reached the Dreamcast. After that though, the series kinda just went quiet. That was that, or so we thought. By 2007, it had been years since Sega Rally had received a major home console entry, while arcade racing itself had changed quite a lot. Burnout had happened, Need for Speed had gone underground, and rally games had increasingly moved towards simulation, or at least simulation-inspired handling. Sega's answer was to not reinvent Sega Rally, it was to build a new studio whose job was essentially to understand why the old formula worked in the first place. Sega Racing Studio was established in the UK in 2005. Sega Rally would become its first and ultimately, and also weirdly, only released game before Sega closed the studio in April 2008. That makes Sega Rally's development especially interesting. This wasn't an existing internal Sega team just casually reviving an old franchise, it was a brand new Sega studio making a statement. And they had one enormous problem. How do you modernize Sega Rally without it becoming every other rally game that's already on the market? And the answer to that question, instead of actually being within the cars, is the terrain.
Hairpin right. Over jump. Easy right.
Though allow me to introduce a word that Sega Racing Studio are calling geodeformation. This is the feature that the game was sold around. I mean, the back of the box literally says about unique deformation technology. The basic idea is very simple. These soft track surfaces aren't static. Every tyre that travels across them actually cuts into the terrain. After 6 cars have gone through the same muddy corner, the road doesn't look like or feel like it did when the race started. There are grooves, ruts, tyre tracks, sections where the original surface has been churned up and suddenly there's water in its place. And those aren't just textures either, this actually affects how the car behaves. The grooves influence your handling, so you kind of have to decide whether to follow the heavily used racing line and risk having an issue, or move on to fresher terrain, where it might be less bumpy, but there also might be less grip. This becomes particularly notable on snow. The first lap can feel relatively smooth, but by the third and final lap, sections of the road have been carved apart by the entire field. Move into an existing rut and the car almost settles into it, but you cross one at the wrong angle, and you can feel your steering react. The effect is done amazingly through the 360 controller's force feedback as well. There's some very good rumble work from this game into the controller, I like it a lot, it's pretty damn cool. Because this isn't one of those racing game technologies where somebody gives a 20-minute presentation at Summer Games Fest explaining something I would never notice if I hadn't seen that presentation. You see it, you feel it, the road begins clean, then everyone destroys it. It's pretty damn straightforward, but it's pretty damn cool. Watching 6 rally cars repeatedly attack a muddy hairpin eventually leaves something that I would call agricultural damage. And because the grooves remain in place, every lap develops slightly differently. Does it completely transform how you race? I mean, no. Not really. You can mostly succeed without treating the road deformation like some incredibly complicated strategy system, but it does make the track feel physical and the racing feel more real. Now, the actual handling is classic Sega Rally, which means that realism left the building pretty much immediately. Every car wants to slide, everything feels pretty damn light, and you can carry absurd amounts of speed into corners. The vehicle begins rotating and you can balance the steering and throttle, and suddenly you're magically travelling sideways at like 90 to 100 miles per hour, while somehow feeling in complete control, and honestly, it's bloody glorious. Sega Rally is not pretending that you're participating in a real rally championship. You are racing 5 other cars simultaneously around enclosed circuits. There isn't even a proper co-driver. Not in the car anyway. The closest thing to authentic rallying is the presence of mud. But it is a pure arcade driving experience, and that's what makes the game work in my opinion. You can pick it up pretty much immediately. The accelerator is mostly something that you hold on to permanently. The brake does exist, but the game kind of treats using it as more of a personal choice. I mean, in the later difficulties and the higher class cars, yeah, you need to a little bit, but mostly it's going to be throttle control and just turning the car to adjust. Turn aggressively into a corner and the car begins sliding, counter steer slightly, keep the power down, and pray and aim for the exit. Initially it does feel like insanely loose. If you come directly from a game like Dirt, the car almost seems to float above the ground like it's hovering. But after you've done a few races, it does begin to make sense. You're not controlling the car through realistic weight transfer, no. You're learning Sega Rally's rhythm. Entry, slide, potentially correction, exit, repeat until someone shouts game over, and once it clicks, it is incredibly satisfying. Especially because the tracks are clearly designed around this handling. Corners flow together, one slide positions you for the next, elevation changes upset the car a lot, and long sweepers allow you to hold some really funny, stupid angles. And because there are always other vehicles around you, you're constantly trying to maintain that rhythm while 5 downright lunatics occupy exactly the part of the road that you wanted. It feels arcade-like in the best possible way. It's very easy to understand, but it's very difficult to master. Surprisingly so, in fact. However, there is one part of the handling that does take Sega Rally's arcade philosophy, what I would say maybe just a bit too far. You basically can't leave the circuit. There are invisible barriers around pretty much everything. Hit the edge of the road and the car simply bounces back towards safety. Trees, rocks, small bushes, decorative scenery. Apparently the entire world has been reinforced using invisible concrete. And honestly, it can look extremely silly, but it is also completely intentional. The game wants you to keep moving forward constantly. It doesn't want a minor mistake to result in your car travelling half a mile down a mountain, while the game spends 15 seconds returning you to the track. Hit the side, bounce off, keep going. And I get it, but I am conflicted. On the one hand, it removes almost all danger from the scenery, but on the other, I'm not really sure I'd want Sega Rally any other way. This is a game where the phrase track limits refers to the physical wall preventing you from leaving. So yeah, it does kind of make sense, but it can look really goofy if you crash into something that definitely should have just been flattened by the car like a bush and then just bounce off of it. Now, whilst this game doesn't have hundreds and hundreds of cars, the car selection here is pretty damn good. It mixes modern rally machinery, modified road cars, classics, and a collection of increasingly ridiculous bonus vehicles. The Premier class begins with recognisable contemporary rally cars, including icons like the Subaru Impreza and Mitsubishi Lancer. Then the modified category starts moving away from straightforward rally machinery and you end up with a modified Fiat Punto, while the Masters class is where Sega Rally begins digging into history. The Lancia Delta, the Toyota Celica, the Ford Escort, the Peugeot 205. Basically a collection of iconic vehicles for an iconic sport. There are also bonus cars that progressively become less concerned with reality, ranging from specialist off-road vehicles like the Hummer to the Hot Wheels RD04. Which means you could begin Sega Rally in a Subaru Impreza and reach a point where you're driving a Hot Wheels car. Excellent. That's completely fine with me. Anyway, there's no upgrades or tuning shop or paint editor or engine swaps. Before a race, the main setup decision is whether you want road or off-road tyre setups. And for me, the off-road setup is always better anyway because most of the game is not on clean tarmac. And that simplicity is definitely deliberate. Sega Rally doesn't want you to spend 10 minutes adjusting your gear ratios, it just wants you to race. Now part of me misses having more control, but another part of me has spent enough of my life looking at upgrade menus, so I think I'll survive with this game. But even so, the cars do actually feel different. I mean, not massively different, but obviously the three major classes have much more obvious differences than individual vehicles within each category. Premier cars are fast but manageable, modified cars feel slightly more aggressive, Master vehicles are often lighter, older, and much more energetic. Within each class, however, Sega Rally prioritizes balance over realism. The developers wanted cars competing directly against one another, and that means something like a Subaru and a Citroen tend to feel more similar than they probably should. You notice differences, some rotate more easily, some feel more stable. But this isn't a proper racing sim where switching cars can require completely relearning the limits. It's closer to selecting characters in an arcade game. Different flavour, same basic language, and for what Sega Rally is trying to achieve here, that does make perfect sense. Now I do just have to give a quick shout out to two different cars that I've used throughout my Sega Rally playthrough. Two cars that I thought I would probably never use in any video game ever. And the first one is the Skoda Fabia. This is just like a generic civilian car, that's how I've always viewed it, but in this game, in the first tier of cars that you get, it's an absolute beast. An absolute beast. And then the modified category is a, well, modified Fiat Punto, an Abarth Punto, I suppose. And oh my god, that thing is insane. It is rapid, it handles so well, it's so much fun, and you know what, it looks pretty damn cool as well. So big shout out to the Skoda Fabia and the Fiat Punto for carrying my Sega Rally playthrough. Now just quickly, if you're enjoying the video, please don't forget to hit that like button, and if you're new around here, tap that subscribe button as well, because it really helps out with my future videos. Anyway, let's get back to Sega Rally. Now, in terms of tracks, there are 5 main environments. You have Safari, Alpine, Canyon, Tropical, and Arctic. Within these are 15 circuit layouts, with some reverse configurations and a couple of bonus tracks, increasing the total number of selectable tracks to about 23 different layouts. And visually, they're pretty damn good. Safari is dry and dusty with broad dirt roads and huge open landscapes. Alpine combines tarmac, gravel, and mountainous scenery. The Canyon mixes fast paved sections with loose climbs. Tropical is full of mud, water, and vegetation. And Arctic, do I even really need to say this part? It's full of snow. A lot of snow. Snow in front of you, snow beside you, snow underneath you. And each environment isn't just visually different, the surfaces genuinely change how the car behaves, and because the deformation system reacts differently depending on the material, the tracks develop in different ways as well. Mud gets deeply rutted, snow gets carved apart, gravel shifts beneath the tyres, tarmac remains comparatively stable. This variety is probably the game's greatest achievement after the handling itself. Driving Tropical immediately after Arctic feels so different that it's like you're playing a different game. The only real problem with the tracks though is quantity. There aren't enough unique routes because half of them are just reversed versions of the normal routes, and the championship mode is more than happy to remind you of that repeatedly.
Easy left. Hairpin right. Easy right.
The Championship is the main single-player progression mode. There are 3 primary tiers corresponding with the game's vehicle classes: Premier, Modified, and Masters. You earn points according to your finishing position, and accumulating enough points unlocks new championships, cars, and eventually the higher categories. And mechanically, that's pretty much everything. There's no story or team management, sponsors, calendar. That's it. You race, then you race somewhere else. Then, in an exciting development, you race again. And this is where I can see opinions splitting. The lack of meaningful modes and progression could make the game too shallow for some players, but others may enjoy the fact that it's so simplistic and with arcade purity. And either stance does make sense. If you want a proper involved career mode, Sega Rally is almost comedically basic. The Championship is essentially an unlock system with races attached, but if the actual racing is all you want, there's very little friction between events, no filler or unnecessary activities. You just finish the race, collect points, and move on. I do kind of miss games being that confident, but I do also miss having more than like 5 environments. Both things can be true. Now, the AI in this game is probably its most frustrating feature. These drivers are pretty damn aggressive. Well, extremely aggressive, to be honest with you, and almost completely committed to their racing line like it's a 90s game, which I guess kind of makes sense. Even if you slam into them, half the time they just don't move, but they're also perfectly willing to knock you out of your way before immediately returning back to their preferred route. And I can confirm that they do kind of behave like that, like your average boy racer in their first BMW. I mean, on the plus side, at least the game doesn't punish you for making contact, because that's going to be happening quite a lot. But because the races are generally quite close, one mistake can be disastrous. If you fall several seconds behind because of the aggressive AI, recovering can be difficult. This does at least make racing tense. In fact, there's very little relaxing in the game, because even when I'm winning, especially on the higher difficulty cups, I'm aware that 5 cars could overtake me at any given moment if I make one small mistake. The result can be frustrating, but at least it's very rarely boring.
Long medium right. 90 left.
Now, in terms of its visuals, Sega Rally still looks surprisingly good. Not technically modern, obviously, this is an Xbox 360 game from 2007. Nobody's going to mistake it for a game running on a Series X, but the visual direction has aged extremely well. Everything is colourful, almost aggressively colourful, bright blue skies, dense green vegetation. You know, the kind of thing that we don't really have in England right now. White snow, orange desert, which sounds more like England right now, and cars covered in enormous amounts of mud. It has that classic Sega arcade aesthetic, where reality has been improved slightly because reality was not saturated enough. The car models look great, mud accumulates across bodywork, drive through the water and sections of that mud wash away, tires carve through the terrain, dust hangs behind cars, snow gets thrown aside. It's one of those games where the environmental effects are doing more to sell the visuals than raw polygon counts. A clean car at the beginning of a tropical race looks completely different by the finish. I mean, don't get me wrong, there are certain just random textures that don't look great, but the game moves so fast anyway that you're never going to be looking at anything for too long outside of the car itself. In terms of the sound design, it kind of fits the same philosophy as everything else. Engines sound aggressive enough without pretending to be meticulous recordings for a simulator, gravel constantly hits the underside, tyres scrape and slide, and environmental effects give each surface a different character. The soundtrack is very arcadey, with music divided across the various environments that suit each one, and it's energetic without completely dominating the game, but it is very, very good. Nothing here has the unforgettable lunacy of the original Sega Rally soundtrack, but it definitely suits the modernized presentation.
Medium right. Maybe. Easy left. Long medium right.
I will also briefly mention that the game did have some pretty impressive multiplayer features as well. It had online racing for up to 6 players, and that 6th player makes perfect sense. The entire game is designed around bumper-to-bumper racing rather than isolated rally stages, so you could compete in normal races and string together multiple tracks into custom sequences. And that sounds pretty cool, but I believe the servers have long since shut down, so there was no real way for me to test this. However, it does have split-screen multiplayer for 2 players, which runs pretty decently all things considered with how good this game looks, so I can't really complain on that front. Now, in terms of critical reception, Sega Rally did pretty well. The 360 version is currently sat at 77 on Metacritic with 42 reviews, with 30 of those being classified as positive. It had scores as high as 92, but also had some reviews going lower than about 65, criticising the shallow progression and limited structure. And that kind of divide describes the game perfectly. If you judge it as a pure arcade racer, it goes unbelievably hard, but if you judge it as a £40 Xbox 360 racing game released in late 2007, the missing content does become kind of hard to ignore, and 2007 was brutal for competition. You know, as I said, Forza Motorsport 2, Dirt, PGR 4, Need for Speed Pro Street, Flat Out Ultimate Carnage, and Test Drive Unlimited had only arrived on the 360 the previous year. Basically, there was a lot of competition in the market, and Sega Rally kind of pulled up doing its own thing, and that own thing was not that much. So is Sega Rally on 360 worth revisiting? I would say so, yeah, absolutely. But I do understand why it was never a huge hit. This game is so much fun to play in short bursts. The handling is brilliant, the power sliding feels fantastic, environments are colourful, the deformation system still looks good today. The whole thing has that particular Sega quality, where someone appears to have asked the question, would this be more fun if it was slightly ridiculous? But if you play for long periods of time, you can see the limitations, with the championship having no depth, the same tracks coming up over and over again, infuriating AI. You know, it's not got that much going on. But I think that's also part of why I like it, because modern racing games can feel exhausting. Enormous maps, hundreds of icons, thousands of events, weekly objectives with exclusive cars that you might miss if you forget to play. I'm sure you know which game I'm kind of talking about right now, but you get the point. There's just so much going on in modern games, and Sega Rally have none of that. Pick car, pick race, go sideways. That's the entire game. And because the underlying driving is so strong, it almost gets away with it completely. So that brings us to the end of our look at Sega Rally on the Xbox 360. What do you guys think of this game? Have you played it? Are you going to go check it out now you've seen this video? Share all your thoughts in the comments down below. If you enjoyed this video, please don't forget to leave a like, and if you haven't done so already, subscribe and tap the bell for notifications to stay up to date with my future uploads. A massive shout out to my Patreon subscribers for the continued support. You guys are awesome, and all I really have left to say is thank you and goodbye.